Mother-in-law versus daughter-in-law war, when money becomes chains. Since childhood, Lynn had always dreamed of a happy family, a place where she and her husband could share joys and sorrows, take care of their children together, and build a peaceful home. She believed that as long as there was love, any storm could be overcome. But life is not a fairy tale. Lynn's dream was shattered the moment she stepped into her husband's house, a place she thought would be a safe haven but turned out to be a gilded cage that trapped her both physically and emotionally. Hung's family home, located in a small neighborhood, looked grand and luxurious from the outside. However, the longer Lynn lived there, the more she felt its coldness and suffocating atmosphere. It wasn't the weather that made it feel this way, but rather the heavy tension that loomed over the house. And the one who controlled everything in this household was none other than Thuan, Lynn's mother-in-law. Thuan was a strong-willed, sharp, and power-driven woman. Every decision in the house had to go through her, from daily meals to major financial investments and even how family members were treated. She never raised her voice, but her words and piercing gaze were enough to make anyone hesitate. Even in her later years, she retained an air of authority, her thin lips always pressed together as if she were constantly calculating her next move. Every line on her face spoke of a woman accustomed to having control. Hung, Lynn's husband, was a kind but weak-willed man. Having been coddled by his mother his entire life, he never learned to stand up for himself. To Thuan, he was the perfect son, obedient, submissive, and never once daring to defy her will. But this so-called perfection was the very thing that made Lynn suffer the most. She had hoped that, at the very least, her husband would be the one to protect her in this marriage. But no, he was nothing more than a shadow in his own home. Choosing silence over confrontation, always letting his mother make every decision for him. Lynn's father-in-law, Mr. Kang, was nothing like his wife. He was a quiet, experienced man, but far too submissive. In his youth, he had been a decisive businessman, running his own enterprise. However, after suffering a major failure, he stepped back and let his wife take control of everything. Now, he was just an aging man who sat silently in the corner of the house, seemingly drained of any will to fight or resist. Lynn had once believed that love could make people stronger. But after stepping into this marriage, she realized that wasn't always the case. A woman could fight for love, but if she was the only one trying, was it enough to stand against an entire family governed by rigid, unyielding rules? Right after the wedding, Lynn was excited to plan her future with Hung. She wanted to save the wedding money so they could eventually buy a small house, a place just for the two of them and their future children. But all those dreams were quickly crushed when Thuan casually said, "I'll keep it safe for you both. Whenever you need it, just ask me." In this house, the elders managed the money to keep everything in order. Her words were sweet, like honey, but Lynn felt an unease creeping in. She glanced at Hung, hoping he would say something, push back even slightly, but he simply nodded in agreement without hesitation. Before Lynn could protest, the nearly 200 million dong had already been taken by Thuan, without question. Without discussion, Lynn reassured herself that it was still family money. If they needed it, surely her mother-in-law would return it. But she was wrong. A month passed. Then too, every time Lynn brought up the money, Thuan either ignored the question or gave a dismissive smile. "That money is being saved for important matters. Don't worry, when you truly need it, I'll give it to you." Lynn began to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the wedding money. Hung's entire salary was also handed over to his mother. Each month, as payday arrived, he would turn over everything without a second thought. Lynn tried to reason with him. "Keep a little for yourself. We need at least some money to cover household expenses." But Hung just scratched his head and laughed it off. "Mom takes care of everything. If you need money, just ask her. She manages it well, so why should we worry? I don't want to bother thinking about finances." Lynn couldn't believe it. She tried to bring up the issue with Thuan, but every time, her mother-in-law had an excuse ready. "If you need anything, just tell me. I'll buy it for you. Saving money is a good habit. You shouldn't spend recklessly. You don't need money right now. It's better to keep it for the future." But when Lynn truly needed money, when she wanted to buy some new clothes for work, when the house ran out of rice, or when she simply wished to send a small amount to her mother, Thuan remained unfazed. "Money is always needed in this house. Just borrow some from someone for now. And I'll sort things out later. Each of these responses chipped away at Lynn's patience, like drops of water slowly filling an overflowing cup. It was at that moment she realized the money was no longer hers. She had no control over the finances in her own household. Even her husband, the one who should have stood up for her, was nothing more than a weak-willed man, allowing his mother to dictate everything. Lynn felt like she was trapped in a carefully laid-out snare, a cage designed just for her. No matter how much she struggled, there was no way out. One day, as she was cleaning the living room, she overheard Thuan's voice drifting from the kitchen. The older woman was speaking to a friend, an elderly lady who seemed quite close to her. "Don't worry, that piece of land is guaranteed to increase in value. I've already taken all the kids' money and invested it. In just a few months, we'll make at least double." Lynn's heart nearly stopped. She held her breath, frozen in place behind the door. "And what about Lynn? Does she know?" the other woman asked. "Know what? I told her I was keeping the money safe. And she just accepted it. What's all this nonsense about personal money? In this house, everything is under my control." Thuan scoffed. Lynn felt her blood rush to her face, her grip tightening around the mop handle. But before she could process her anger, Thuan continued, "Oh, and I gave some to Phong too. He's been unemployed for so long. If I don't help him, who will? Family has to support each other, right?" Lynn's mind reeled. Phong, Hung's older brother, was a lazy freeloader, unwilling to work for years. He had survived entirely on his mother's money. And now, their savings, her money and Hung's, had been handed over to him so easily. Lynn couldn't take it anymore. That night, she pulled Hung into their room, her voice trembling with anger. "Do you have any idea what your mother has done? She took all our money and invested it in land. And on top of that, she gave money to Phong for his expenses." Hung furrowed his brows, looking slightly surprised, but instead of getting angry, he simply sighed, his voice calm and indifferent. "Don't make a big deal out of it. Mom always has her reasons. She's thought everything through. She won't let us lose out." Lynn stared at her husband, unable to believe what she was hearing. She had hoped for resistance, even a small sign of frustration. But instead, all she found was pathetic submission. Disappointment surged like a tidal wave. For the first time, she realized that the man standing beside her wasn't just weak, he had no intention of ever standing up for her. In that cold, empty room, Lynn felt utterly alone, a mother's sacrifice and a father's hidden kindness. As Lynn's pregnancy progressed, her body grew heavier, and her health declined. Dizziness and nausea became a daily struggle. But her meals remained the same, plain boiled greens and dry salted peanuts. She needed meat. She needed proper nutrition to nourish the twins growing inside her. But every time she pleaded, Thuan dismissed her with the same cold response. "Back in my day, I didn't have fancy meals when I was pregnant either. But I still gave birth just fine." Many nights, Lynn lay awake, her stomach growling in hunger. But there was nothing she could do except swallow her tears. Hung remained indifferent, never once stepping up to demand better care for his wife. Lynn felt utterly hopeless. If she stayed here, she wouldn't just lose her health, she could lose her children. With no other choice, she decided to seek help from her mother. When Mai saw her daughter's pale, exhausted face, she burst into tears and pulled Lynn into a tight embrace. "How could you let yourself suffer like this, Lynn?" But while Lynn was gone, Thuan spread rumors to the neighbors, painting her as lazy and irresponsible, accusing her of abandoning her husband and household duties. Refusing to accept defeat, Lynn turned to the only person in that house who might still have compassion, her father-in-law. Mr. Kang, standing before him, her voice trembled as she fought back tears. "Dad, please help me. I can't live like this anymore." Kang looked at his daughter-in-law, seeing the weariness in her eyes. He sighed deeply before silently retrieving a bundle of cash from an old wooden box. "Take this, my child. I can't do much, but at the very least, take care of my grandchildren." Holding the money in her hands, Lynn's fingers trembled as tears streamed down her face. For the first time in that house, someone had truly cared for her. But she knew all too well, Thuan would not stay silent once she found out. As usual, the next morning, Thuan checked the safe where she kept her money. But today, as she opened it, she froze. The cash was gone. A sinking feeling welled up inside her. She stormed through the house, interrogating the maids, demanding answers from Hung, but no one knew anything. Then, suddenly, it hit her. Kang Thuan stormed out of the house, her face twisted with rage, when she spotted Kang playing chess with his old friends at the neighbor's house. She could no longer hold back. She charged toward him, her voice sharp as a blade. "Did you steal my money? Do you even know what you're doing?" The peaceful atmosphere shattered instantly. The elderly men stopped their game, exchanging uneasy glances. Kang lifted his head, his expression calm but tired. "That was money for our son and daughter-in-law. Why do you need to keep it?" Thuan's face turned pale, her fists clenching. To her, this wasn't just about money, it was betrayal. The husband she had dominated for years had suddenly dared to defy her. Fury coursed through her veins. "Do you even realize what you've done? You're helping her go against me. She's a daughter-in-law, not a guest. She has no right to take money without my permission." Kang remained silent for a long moment before finally sighing. "You've controlled her long enough. She doesn't even have a single penny for herself. And now, even while she's pregnant, you still won't let her go." His words cut through Thuan like a knife. She couldn't believe the man she had always dismissed as weak would dare say such things. But instead of backing down, her anger only burned hotter. Without another word, she turned and walked away, seething with resentment. From that day on, her gaze toward Lin grew colder. There was no more pretense, no more forced politeness. Every word she spoke carried a sting of sarcasm and disdain. If before she had at least kept up appearances, now Lin could feel it clearly. Thuan saw her as nothing more than a thorn in her side. The atmosphere in the house grew suffocating. Lin knew this storm was far from over. And this time, Thuan would not let her off easily. The illusion of change. After enduring so much pain, Lin finally gave birth to 2 healthy baby boys. She had hoped this moment would be a turning point, a fresh start, but instead, it only unmasked the true nature of her mother-in-law. Thuan's attitude flipped overnight. The once cold and harsh woman suddenly became the doting grandmother, cradling her grandsons with a tenderness Lin had never seen before. She smiled and cooed at them, even boasting to the neighbors, "These boys are a blessing from the heavens." But when the hospital bill came, Thuan conveniently forgot to bring money. In that moment, Lin felt as if a bucket of ice water had been dumped over her. She had always known what kind of person her mother-in-law was. But even she hadn't expected such cruelty. In the face of urgency, it was not her husband or her in-laws who stepped forward, it was her own mother. Without hesitation, Mai paid the full amount. Her eyes filled with sorrow as she looked at her daughter, who had just given birth yet was already drowning in disappointment. Lin lay in her hospital bed, watching her 2 newborns sleep peacefully. A bitter sadness filled her chest. She couldn't go back. "I'm not returning to that house, Mom," Lin whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Mai didn't say a word, she only squeezed her daughter's hand tightly. She understood. This was not an impulsive decision. It was inevitable, after everything Lin had endured. Meanwhile, Hung, despite deeply loving his wife and children, remained under his mother's control. When Lin and the twins didn't return home, he found himself trapped in a painful dilemma. After much internal struggle, he finally gathered the courage to ask his mother for money to bring his family back. But instead of the support he hoped for, Thuan coldly refused. "Her mother has plenty of money. Let them handle it." The words cut through Hung like a knife. This wasn't the first time his mother had prioritized money over family. But this time, he couldn't ignore it. For the first time in his life, he saw the cold calculation behind every word she spoke. After enduring pressure from both his wife and his own conscience, Hung finally came to a realization. One evening, when it was just the 2 of them in the living room, he summoned every ounce of courage to confront his mother. "Mom, I don't want to be controlled anymore. I want to take care of my own family. Stop holding onto my money." Thuan set her teacup down, her eyes sharp and unreadable. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lash out, yet her words shook Hung to his core. "Then leave her. I'll find you a better wife, one who's richer. So you won't have to suffer like you did with that girl Lin." Hung froze. For years, he had believed his mother was simply strict, that her actions stemmed from love and concern for him. But in this moment, the truth hit him like a slap in the face. His mother had never truly cared about him. She only cared about money. He took a step back, staring at the woman who had given birth to him, now a stranger who terrified him. In his mind, Lin's words echoed, the tears she had shed, the countless times she had pleaded for his support while he stood silent. Now, he stood before the hardest decision of his life. Would he walk away from everything to follow his wife and children? Or would he remain in his mother's shadow forever? Standing in the middle of his grand but hollow home, Hung realized he had never felt so alone. Lin had no other choice. She had fought, she had hoped, but in the end, the man she once loved could not stand by her side. She looked at Hung one last time, not with pain or resentment, but with resignation. I can't do this anymore. Hung, I want a divorce. Hung stood there, his lips parting as if to say something. But in the end, he remained silent. He knew that no matter how much he begged or promised, Lin would never trust him again. Their marriage had been dead for a long time. It was only now that she was finally walking away. The day Lin left that house, a light drizzle fell from the sky, holding her 2 children close. She stepped through the grand gates without looking back. No one stopped her, not even Hung. He stood on the porch, his hands clenched into fists, yet unable to move. Behind him, Thuan watched with an expressionless face, as if everything had played out exactly as she had planned. A hollow existence. In the days that followed, Hung felt lost in his own home. Every night, he returned to a house that was still brightly lit, yet devoid of warmth. The once lively dinner table had become a silent, joyless place, where the only sound was the clinking of utensils against empty plates. His mother continued to run the household as she always had, but for the first time, it no longer felt right. Hung found himself reminiscing about the days when Lin was still there. She was always busy, always moving, yet every corner of the house had carried a piece of her. The laughter of their children, the stories she used to share over meals, now, they were nothing but memories. And as time passed, the emptiness inside him grew. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost the only true home he had ever known. 6 months later, Hung remarried. This time, his bride was a wealthy woman, just as his mother had wanted. But this was not a marriage built on love. His new wife was practical, ambitious, and concerned only with financial gain. Hung became a husband in name only, present in the household but absent in every other sense. With no voice, no happiness. Every morning, he woke up in a lavish yet soulless house, beside a wife who never once asked how he felt. Their meals were no longer about family, but about investments, business ventures, and high society connections. Slowly, he realized he was no longer himself, just a man carrying the title of husband, yet completely meaningless in his own marriage. A new beginning. Meanwhile, Lin was starting over from nothing. She rented a small house, modest, but filled with warmth. Each morning, she rushed to prepare breakfast for her 2 children before heading off to work. Money was tight. Every expense had to be carefully calculated. But she had never felt more free. There was no one to belittle her, no one to control her. Life was difficult, but at least she was the one in charge of it now. Some nights, after putting her children to sleep, Lin would sit by the window with a cup of hot tea. Gazing out at the city lights, she thought back to the years she had spent in her husband's home, the times she had endured, the moments she had swallowed her pain. But the sadness was gone. All that remained was peace. When Lin heard that Hung had remarried, she simply smiled, a faint, indifferent smile. It was not one of satisfaction, nor of resentment, but the smile of someone who had truly let go of the past. She gently pulled her 2 children close and softly said, "The one to be pitied the most is not us, but him." The painful days were behind her now. Ahead lay a new path, one without Hung, without a controlling mother-in-law, just her and her 2 children. Building a better life together. She knew the road would not be easy, but no matter how difficult it became, she would keep moving forward. Because this time, she wasn't just living for herself, but for the 2 innocent souls looking up at her with wide, trusting eyes. This story does not have a fairy tale ending, but it carries a profound truth. It reminds us that not everyone can change, that sacrifices do not always lead to happiness, and that sometimes, the only way to truly live is to walk away from what is toxic. Lin was no longer a woman who endured in silence. She had chosen to step forward, to carve out her own destiny, not without hardship, but with hope. This is a powerful message for anyone trapped in an unhealthy relationship. Letting go is not failure, it is the beginning of something new. Lynn's journey leaves us with a valuable lesson about love, marriage, and a woman's independence. Life doesn't always turn out the way we wish. But what truly matters is having the courage to seek real happiness. Happiness is not about holding onto a relationship at all costs. It is about knowing when to let go and choosing to live a life that truly belongs to you. What do you think about this story? If you were in Lynn's place, what would you have done? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, don't forget to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another great story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.